This is part of the stability and beautiful variation harbored in the culture of an allegedly stable and even naturalized national community. The museum answers explicitly or quietly by interplaying voice and silences in dealing with old conflicts. In my country, the dissolution of the Swedish Empire in 1809 and 1905 was celebrated in the early 21st century, that is, right the last 10 years. But the victories of Imperial Sweden, the bloody victories of Imperial Sweden in the 17th century, is silenced. That is not part of our memory. Our losses are. They are passed quietly. The role of the nation, and you might of course add with Italian examples where classical Rome and the Risorgimento, especially this year, is played around us, while the struggle against the Vatican in the late 19th century or the fascist period is played down within the museum community. This is the interplay between silence and exhibition. What part of the economy? Now, I'm moving now to how the historical change is being treated and sometimes proactively treated in museums. Moving from the agricultural economy to the industrial economy, which has happened all over the world, agriculture becomes a museum object. What part of the economy is after agriculture ready to be the next in line for ending up at historical museums? And what parts points towards the future? The question is not always answered post facto, but established as an argument for where to place hopes and investments for the future. Utilizing national museums in competition between nations and metropolises and as investments in the experience economy is a contemporary factor adding to older objectives of securing heritage. Another example of a will to change or adjust to changing political balances concerns the frequent conflicts about the restitution of objects and human remains. The narrative of these issues treat questions of historical change in many ways. The European Union is troubled by disputes in many dimensions about democratic deficit, migration, territorial expansion, integration, and weak performances. A free market, as well as ideas of universal human rights, are in fact localized, embedded, and negotiated in institutions like cultural museums too. A growing attention to cultural policy as a necessary political dimensions to pursue political goals is feeding into the 7th Framework Program for Research. That's why we are here. It's recognized as problematic, the inclusion, integration, the cultural policy being mostly a national concern, sometimes only a regional concern. But slowly the European Union is taking a greater piece of making cultural policy for European policy. And our answer to the call was this project on mapping how and with what consequences these authoritative institutions, national museums, has created a long-standing values and identities in need of attention, regardless of your political preferences. If you love them or if you would like to deconstruct them, you need to have knowledge about them. This is a short list of our areas of research or projects, as we used to say before entering the European framework. Now we talk about work packages to an ever stronger proportion. This research in our project is pursued through a multidisciplinary collaboration, but I dare say that yours is even more multidisciplinary, or your partners show a greater diversity than ours does. We have art history, cultural history, media studies, cultural studies, something like that, but we are mostly traditional university partners, and we don't have this strong partnership with the cultural institutions. We have them as reference groups, but while you have them as partners. I think that makes it interesting that you have a stronger idea of how to involve yourself beyond dissemination within the work of your project. The first work, well, this is just a list. I will talk briefly on these. The first one, which is, well, perhaps I could go back. This chart shows where we are right now, really. The work package 2 is about to finish. We will show the main results in Bologna in just a couple of weeks from that one. And when what we do in that one will feed into the other work packages, because this is a sort of complete survey of the institution that we call national museums in Europe, how they have grown into being, how they have interacted with state and nation making in Europe. That is what we call mapping and framing institutions. And what could be better than this image of a map in Deutsches Historisches Museum, where it happens that Germany is in the center and the map is always sort of shrinking and going up and down around Germany. This overview of the most important museums established to fulfill the function of national museums in all European countries, which surprisingly has never been done before, will try to achieve several objectives, all of them possible to attain through the comparative method. And if I have time, I will just show you briefly in the end a short analysis of Italy that might be interesting to test with you. The first project gives us the general patterns of what museums were initiated and realized by whom, with what agenda, and with what consequences. In the first step, it is the interaction with political state-making that is analyzed, covering all European states. One hypothesis is that the actual history of state-making is of importance for the role played by museums, since empires, old, well-established and unthreatened states, did not have and still do not have exactly the same needs as nations more recently struggling to form nation-states. Finland and Norway show different patterns than Sweden and Denmark. Greece, Italy and Germany have partly other priorities than France and UK. The role of empires in initiating colonial museums at home or abroad is also considered. In the second project, our research penetrates deeper into explicit narratives of unity and destiny of the nation, as well as the opposite, the treatment of conflicts and heritage wars that exists in all nations. There is tension between striving towards a hegemonic representation of the cultural and political history of a country and oppositional voices of many kinds coming from other nations and minorities, as well as regional aspects, class and gender tensions that demand representation in these prestigious arenas, or a new narrative assigning them a more prominent role. The conflicts over heritage range from a targeted destruction of heritage in war via international battles for the ownership of artifacts to issues of how to represent or integrate minorities. Italy, for example, have been active on both sides of the desk, both demanding artifacts back and having to leave back to colonies. So this is a complicated and symbolic issue of great importance to the national imagination. All narratives are, however, not explicit. In the third project, the implicit messages of architecture, city plans, the place of museums in the city plans, and the whole assemblage of national museums will be interpreted in a number of states. We cannot cover all Europe in these. We will make a selection. Art museums are especially interesting since they do claim to stand for universal aesthetic values, but at the same time assess narratives in several dimensions on the grandeur of the host, carried by the arrangement of collections and exhibitions. Another aspect of the spatial arrangement of national museums is the relationship between representation centralized to the capital and the existence of various distributed performances of the national, such as the many local and regional, very important museums in Italy. How is the national constructed in collecting and interacting with regional identities and marginalized communities? The third dimension in this implicit narrative is the impact of the new medias, the digitalization of the heritage. How is representation of communities being made when they go beyond the individual museums? National museums have from the start been utopian, visionary projects carried by politicians, intellectuals and scholars, citizens in the state and in civil society. The hopes of cultural politicians to use museums as tools for education, tourism and integration interplay with the formulation of the National Museum's professionals and directors themselves. In the fourth project, this dynamic is explored for the last 2 decades on both national and on European policy-making levels. Now we have a good view of the setup, trajectories and importance of the institutional framework, the explicit and implicit narratives that negotiate meaning, conflicts and directions, the major actors' hopes for the future. The question remains that were asked also before lunch: how does this matter to the audience? And the fifth study will work and concern audiences in a set of European countries with a view to mapping the experience of visiting by both quantitative and qualitative methods.